Melissa Gilbert spent most of her life defending Michael Landon. On set, in interviews, even after his death, she said nothing but kind things. But now, she's finally revealing what she kept to herself for over 30 years. It wasn't about scandal. It wasn't about betrayal. It was about love and disappointment. And the moment she realized that the man she idolized had also let her down, she stayed quiet for decades. But the truth still hurts because it came from someone she once called a second father. Before she ever stepped onto the set of Little House on the Prairie, Melissa Gilbert was just a child trying to navigate the chaos of a broken home. Her father had died when she was a toddler. Her mother, though loving, was busy chasing roles, marriages, and distractions. What Melissa needed wasn't a co-star. She needed an anchor, and when she met Michael Landon, that's exactly what he became. From the very first day on set, Michael didn't treat Melissa like a prop or a sidekick. He treated her like a daughter. At just 9 years old, Melissa was thrust into a world of cameras, expectations, and grown-up schedules. But Michael made it feel safe, warm, even magical. He gave her a nickname. He teased her during breaks. He taught her how to hit her mark, how to deliver her lines, and more importantly, how to carry herself with grace in a world that didn't always offer it. To Melissa, he wasn't just Charles Ingalls. He was the father she'd lost, reincarnated in denim and flannel. And he seemed to understand exactly what she needed. He gave her advice about boys. He made sure she was protected on set. He included her in family gatherings, invited her into his real life. She sat at his dinner table, played with his children, called him Papa, and he called her Half Pint, even when the cameras weren't rolling. That bond, forged under the hot California sun and the haze of nostalgia-drenched Prairie sets, wasn't just for show. Felt real, solid, unshakable. But what Melissa didn't realize, what no child ever does, is that sometimes our heroes are human. And being human means they can also break your heart. Michael Landon was a man in control. He wrote, directed, produced, and starred. What he said went. And Melissa, young, eager to please, desperate for connection, never questioned that power. Not once. She wanted to believe he was perfect. She needed to believe it, because if Michael wasn't safe, who was? The industry loved him, audiences adored him, and Melissa, she worshipped him. But over the years, she began to notice things. Small things, cracks, tension on set, whispers behind the scenes, a shift in his energy. First, she thought it was just stress. Later, she'd come to understand he was wrestling with things even she couldn't fix. Still, she stayed quiet, even when she saw how he treated people differently when the cameras weren't around. Even when she noticed who he favored and who he didn't. Even when the man who once protected her began pulling away without a word. But she never spoke about it. Not during the show. Not when it ended. Not even after his death. Because for Melissa, saying anything critical about Michael felt like betrayal. It felt like turning on the one man who gave her something no one else did, stability. And yet, that silence, she now admits, came at a cost. A part of her always wondered, if he really saw her as family, why didn't he check in when it mattered most? Why didn't he reach out when she was lost? And why, in the end, did she feel like just another child actor left to grow up without guidance? She never got the answers, but the questions never stopped hurting. It didn't happen all at once. Michael Landon didn't storm off a set or deliver a cruel speech. There wasn't one big fight, no headline-making fallout. But for Melissa Gilbert, there was a moment, a single look, that broke the spell. She remembers it vividly, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. They were filming one of the later seasons of Little House on the Prairie. By that point, the magic had started to fade. Ratings were slipping. Michael was juggling more responsibility than ever. And Melissa, now a teenager, was growing up, both on camera and off. That day, she'd messed up a line. Something simple. A fumble any actor could make. She turned to Michael instinctively, the way she always had, expecting a joke, a smile, a gentle nudge. Instead, he just looked at her, not with anger, not even disappointment, just detachment. It was the first time she felt like an employee, like a number on a call sheet, not a daughter figure, not half pint. He moved on with the scene. No words, no warmth, just a cool nod, and back to work. Melissa kept smiling. She laughed it off, but inside something cracked. For years, Michael had been the man she ran to, the protector, the confidant, the grounding presence on set. But in that moment, she realized he could also be distant, removed, focused on the bigger picture. A director first, producer second, and somewhere far down the list, a father figure if it was convenient. She didn't cry that day. She didn't say a word to anyone, but she never forgot that look. It made her question everything. Had their bond only been real to her? Was she just another young actress he helped shape before moving on? The truth is, Michael Landon had his own struggles. By then, his personal life was in turmoil. His divorce had played out in the tabloids. He was facing criticism from colleagues, pressure from the network, and an exhausting production schedule. Melissa now knows he was likely burned out, emotionally and physically. But at the time, she was still a teenager. And teenagers don't analyze. They absorb. They internalize. She blamed herself. She started tiptoeing around him, second-guessing, trying to win his approval all over again. She thought maybe she'd done something wrong. Maybe she'd grown up too fast. Maybe she'd said the wrong thing, laughed at the wrong time, taken up too much space. That one look planted a seed of doubt that never really left. And even years later, long after the show ended, long after Michael's death, Melissa still carried it. That's why she stayed quiet. Because how do you talk about the moment your hero became human? How do you admit that the man you loved like a father may not have seen you the same way in return? How do you tell fans that behind the scenes of the most wholesome family show on television, the father-daughter bond everyone admired wasn't always what it seemed? You don't. Not when you're still sorting through the grief yourself. Not when you still feel guilty for even thinking it. So Melissa smiled in interviews. She shared the warm stories, the memories that made her heart ache less. She defended Michael Landon's legacy, and she meant it. But underneath all that love was a silence. One that only recently she felt brave enough to break. Because sometimes what hurts the most isn't what was said, it's what was never spoken at all. When Little House on the Prairie finally ended, Melissa Gilbert expected the transition to be hard. What she didn't expect was silence. For nearly a decade, she'd seen Michael Landon almost every day. He'd been her mentor, her protector, her father figure, and in her heart, she assumed that bond would last long after the final episode aired. But when the cameras stopped rolling, so did the closeness. There was no farewell dinner, no heart-to-heart, no handwritten note, just a wrap party. And then nothing. Melissa waited. She thought maybe he was just decompressing. Maybe he needed time. She told herself he'd call, or invite her to lunch, or check in the way he used to. But the call never came. Weeks turned into months, then years, and still nothing. She followed his career from a distance. He moved on to Highway to Heaven, surrounded by a new cast and crew. He looked happy, content. Melissa, meanwhile, was entering adulthood without the man she once leaned on most. And the silence? It was deafening. First, she blamed herself. Had she done something to upset him? Had she outgrown the role of half-pint in his eyes? Was she just another child actor whose usefulness had run its course? The questions haunted her. Even as she booked new roles and built a life of her own, there was always a quiet ache, a part of her that felt discarded, like a beloved toy packed away once it had served its purpose. But what hurt the most was the way it made her doubt the years they'd shared. Had it all been real, or was it just a performance? Melissa eventually came to understand that Michael Landon was a complicated man. He was focused, driven, and fiercely private. He had a pattern of closing chapters, cleanly, definitively, without looking back. Maybe that was his way of surviving in an industry that devours sentiment. But even knowing that didn't stop the pain. Because for Melissa, it hadn't been a role. It had been a lifeline, a bond she thought was unbreakable. and the abrupt end left her with wounds that didn't heal with time. When Michael was diagnosed with cancer in 1991, Melissa was shocked. She hadn't spoken to him in years. There was no reunion, no chance to clear the air. She wanted to reach out. She thought about it often, but something held her back. Part of her feared he wouldn't answer, that he wouldn't remember things the way she did. Another part of her wasn't sure what she'd even say, so she stayed quiet again. By the time she gathered the courage to write him a letter, it was too late. Michael Landon died just 3 months after revealing his diagnosis. Melissa attended the funeral. She wept quietly, away from the cameras. She hugged his family, smiled for the press, and told stories that made people laugh. But inside, she was unraveling. There were things she'd wanted to say, questions she'd never asked, emotions she'd buried for years. And now the chance was gone forever. The silence that began after Little House never ended. And it became the thing she regretted most. Because she didn't want to tarnish his memory. She didn't want to seem ungrateful or bitter. But she also couldn't deny the ache of being left behind. She'd loved him like a father. But at the end, she was just another castmate reading the news like everyone else. That was the moment she realized. Sometimes the people who save you don't always stay. And that absence can hurt even more than the goodbye you never got. For decades, Melissa Gilbert kept the best parts of her story with Michael Landon wrapped in reverence. She shared the laughter, the lessons, the moments that made Little House on the Prairie feel like more than just a TV show. But she never talked about the silence. Not publicly, not even to people who asked. When fans spoke to her at signings or events, the question always came up. What was Michael really like? She smiled. He was wonderful, and then she moved on. She had convinced herself that was all the world needed to know. That to protect his memory, she had to protect the myth. But time has a way of softening fear. And in recent years, Melissa began to speak more openly. Not out of anger or revenge, but out of honesty. Out of love even. Because the truth is, she never stopped loving him. But she had to stop idealizing him. And when she finally admitted what she'd kept hidden for so long, it surprised even those closest to her. She admitted the pain of being left behind, the confusion of being shut out, the guilt of wondering what she could have done differently. She admitted that she'd felt forgotten, not just by a man she considered a father, but by someone who knew just how much she'd needed him to stay. She admitted that she had protected Michael Landon's legacy for years, even when it hurt. And she admitted something else, too. Something that took her the longest to say out loud. She was angry, not furious, not bitter, but quietly, deeply wounded. Because he never explained the distance. He never said goodbye. And worst of all, he never reached out in her darkest moments. Melissa has been honest about her struggles. Addiction, divorce, the growing pains of becoming an adult in the spotlight. And through it all, she wished, silently, that Michael would call, that he would be the rock she remembered. But he didn't, and she stopped expecting it. When she finally admitted that, her voice cracked. Because saying it out loud meant acknowledging something she'd fought for years. The man who once felt like home had become a ghost. In interviews, memoirs, and quiet moments of reflection, she has slowly pieced together the story of their relationship. Not just the good, but the aching gaps in between. And the question everyone asks is always the same. Why did you wait so long to tell the truth? Her answer is simple. Because she wasn't ready. Because part of her still wanted to believe in the version of Michael Landon that wore suspenders and spoke with wisdom. Because part of her felt it was her duty to guard the image fans cherished. And because she thought if she said it out loud, it might change how people saw him. But now, she realizes something else. Telling the truth doesn't erase the love. It honors it. Because real love survives disappointment. And real relationships are never perfect. By admitting the pain, she's not destroying his memory. She's finally telling the whole story. The one where a girl needed a father, and found one, and lost him, and learned how to carry both grief and gratitude in the same breath. Melissa Gilbert didn't stay quiet to deceive. She stayed quiet to protect. And now, she speaks, not to take anything away, but to finally let go of the weight she's carried since she was a child. Melissa Gilbert has never been one to chase headlines. She doesn't speak just to be heard. But in recent years, as time has softened her memories and sharpened her self-awareness, one truth has emerged from the fog of silence. She loved Michael Landon, and she still does. Not in a naive, starry-eyed way. Not in the way a little girl once adored a father figure on a television set. But in the way a woman, decades later, can finally see the man behind the myth, flaws and all, and still choose to remember the good. Because for all the pain of being left behind, for all the unanswered questions and private heartbreak, there were also moments that shaped her forever. She still hears his voice when she's unsure on set. She still remembers his laugh, booming, mischievous, unforgettable. She still calls him Papa in her heart. And if she could say just one thing to him now, it wouldn't be an accusation. It wouldn't even be a question. It would be simple, I wish you had stayed. Not just in her life, but in that bond, in that father-daughter space she carved out so fiercely, even if it only ever lived in her own heart. Melissa has spent much of her adult life trying to reconcile what she remembers with what truly was. And maybe there's no clean answer. Maybe Michael Landon loved her in his way and couldn't say it. Or maybe he moved on, as people do when one chapter ends and another begins. But what she's finally made peace with is this. Her pain is not a betrayal. It's a reflection of how deeply she felt the connection, and how real it was for her. In today's world, fans still romanticize Little House on the Prairie. They see it as pure, gentle, untouched by scandal. And Melissa doesn't want to ruin that. She lived that magic too. But she also lived the cost. Behind the soft focus lens was a young girl desperate to hold onto the one stable man in her world. And when that man disappeared without warning, she learned how to survive disappointment in silence. For years, she hid that hurt, smiled through interviews, recounted the best of times. Now, she knows that silence helped no one, not even his legacy. Because Michael Landon wasn't a villain. He was human, brilliant, charismatic, imperfect, and like many men of his time, he kept his vulnerabilities hidden. He taught through strength, not softness. And he likely never realized how deeply his absence affected the girl who once ran to him between every take. Today, Melissa lives with a kind of quiet peace. She's shared her truth, not to rewrite history, but to reclaim her voice. And in doing so, she's given others permission to look at their own complicated relationships without shame. Her story isn't about blame. It's about courage. The courage to say, I was hurt, but I still loved him, and I always will. If Michael were here, maybe he'd offer the words he never said back then. Or maybe he'd simply listen. Either way, Melissa has stopped waiting. She's no longer the child hoping for a call. She's the woman who found her voice, and used it, finally, to tell the story only she could tell. Melissa Gilbert's silence wasn't cowardice. It was loyalty. Loyalty to a man she once adored, to a show that shaped her youth, and to a memory that, for decades, she wasn't ready to question. But silence can become a burden. And when it lingers too long, it starts to sound like agreement. Like everything was okay. Like there was no pain worth naming. That's why her recent honesty has mattered. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's true. She didn't tarnish Michael Landon's legacy. She honored it by telling the whole story. A story about love and absence, about admiration and disappointment, about a little girl who looked up to a man as a father figure, and the woman she became when he wasn't there to say goodbye. And in speaking now, she's not just letting go of decades of guilt. She's showing that even the most beloved memories can carry shadows. Michael Landon will always be remembered as Charles Ingalls, the wise, kind, loving father. But to Melissa, he was something far more complicated and more real. And while she may never get to say all the things she held back, one truth remains. She never stopped loving him, even when the silence hurt more than the goodbye. For more emotional stories, check out this video.